I undertook this and created some madness days ago. I've been working on this one for days. And because it's kind of a pain in the backside, if you know what I'm saying. So, trying to measure misery is something I've tried to do on this channel before. So, what I did was I said, all right, any team that's missed the playoffs in the last 5 years, that's plus 50 points for misery. I didn't take any points off. I did something like this before, but I took points off for winning things. And I thought, no, not taking points off this time. We're going to see how it turns out. So if you missed the playoffs in the last 5 years, it's plus 50 points. If you're out in the first round, that's plus 30 points. If you're out in the second round, that's plus 10. Years 6 through 10, if you miss the playoffs, it's plus 30. If you're out in the first round, it's plus 10. If you're out in the second round, it's plus 5. And then I went back to the year that we came out of the lockout, 05-06. Those 3 years after that are plus 20 points for missing the playoffs, and I took away adding points for being out in the first or second round. My initial plan was to go all the way to 20 years and have 2 columns for each, and there's just not enough room. And I said to myself, that's too much. That's not going to give you an accurate misery index either, because there's going to be teams that were really good before the there were teams that were really good before the lockout that haven't been since, and you're going to have things skewed, and it's going to look kind of off. So what I did was I put all this up here, and I looked at it, and I went, all right, that's nice. And I walked away because it's too much information. Then a couple days after, I went through and I tallied everything up, looked at the tallying. This gave me a headache halfway through. I got a migraine halfway through this one. And I was like, all right, so that's enough of that crap. And this morning, I actually figured out the standings. So there's your all 30 teams on the board. The only team not on the board, of course, is Vegas. So what I've got here, this is how I came up with the numbers. I've explained it. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit pause. And after, we're going to do the countdown on the misery index of 1 through 31. Spoiler alert, 31 is Vegas. And 30 through 1 are derived from the numbers I reached through this misery. And if teams are tied, I had to measure which one I felt was more in a state of misery right now by whether or not they made the playoffs and how recently and how many times, that kind of thing. So if a team made the playoffs last year, whereas another team didn't, and they're both tied for the same amount of points, the team that made the playoffs last year, I consider their fan base to have less misery they're living with right now. The idea is to come up with which fans are actually suffering the most right now. Which fan base can you look at and say, hey, so you guys are suffering the most based on those numbers. So with that all being said, and these 13 years worth of numbers on the board, let's get to it. So based on the fact that the Vegas Golden Knights have been in the league for 1 year, and in that 1 year they made the Stanley Cup Finals, their misery accumulated 0 points. None. Zip. So number 30 on the list, which shouldn't really surprise anybody, is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, number 30 with 95 points. In the playoffs a lot, Stanley Cup wins, Stanley Cup Finals, all that wonderful stuff means that your fan base is less miserable than other fan bases. Number 29. These guys are always in the playoffs. Anaheim, 140 points. So always being in the playoffs will lead to less misery, and getting out of the first round will definitely lead to less as well. And that's been the case with Anaheim. So while Anaheim fans may say, hey, we've been playing miserable, they also won a cup in 07. So for that reason, I'm perfectly fine with them being number 29. Number 28, San Jose. San Jose as well, 145 points. They often make the playoffs. They don't miss the playoffs very often at all. And they did have that Stanley Cup final run. And of course, if you're in the semifinals, or the conference finals, or the Stanley Cup final, you will accumulate 0 points that year. Tied with 145 points are the New York Rangers. So I know for Rangers fans right now, this feels like a lot of misery. They might look at this and go, you got us at 27. I think you got it wrong. But I can only go with what the numbers tell me, which is that compared to other fan bases, the Rangers have had a little bit more to cheer for since the lockout ended. Number 26, Capitals. That's right, this year's Stanley Cup champions. By virtue of winning the Stanley Cup and not ending up accumulating another 30 points, which would have bumped them up to here. I'm perfectly fine with that. Because here's the thing, winning a Stanley Cup on this does mean you don't accumulate points that year. But the Capitals have been accumulating a lot of points over a lot of years. So while this Stanley Cup feels nice, there was a quote from Ovechkin where he said they're trying not to suck back to back, which is awesome. That is a great quote, and that should be on all Washington Capitals merchandise everywhere. Next up on the list with 180 points is Nashville. Nashville Predators, 180 points, means that their fan base has a little more misery than those of the teams below them. And again, I actually really liked how this turned out. I looked at all these on the board this morning, and I thought, you know what, this is actually pretty accurate for which fan bases right now are dealing with the most feeling of, okay, it's our turn. Our turn, number 24, Chicago. Chicago's mildly surprising in that they've won the Stanley Cup 3 times, but they've also had some pretty rough periods before the Stanley Cup, and now they're going through another one. So they added 50 points this year. And if not for those 50 points this year, they'd be down here where Anaheim is. But this year has made it seem maybe they're going to a bit of a darker time. So Chicago ends up with 190. This is when Nashville fans say, no. A lot of fans are going to say no. 23, Boston. Boston's had some lean times. They accumulate 100 or 210 points. And for Boston, as a Boston fan, I can say that having won the Cup in 2011, as fun as that was, getting to the Stanley Cup final in 2013 was fun as well. There have been some pretty rough times and some playoff misses that haven't made me very happy. At number 22 is Detroit. So the Detroit Red Wings, who are coming off of the first time since the 80s, they've missed the playoffs back-to-back seasons. They have 215 points currently accumulated, which means they jump past Boston in this year's. And this is a formula I can probably keep into next year. And then we can see how things change next year after another year of standings is taken in. And again, remember, this is over a 13-year period. This isn't a 1 or 2 or a 5-year thing. So Detroit moves up to almost the middle. They're getting into that area, but they've won a Stanley Cup or 2 in their time, so they can't be completely miserable. With 220 points, at 21 is Tampa. Now you'll notice that Tampa is tied for that total for a team with also 220 points, which is Montreal. Now, looking at it on the board, it's hard to argue that between the two, Montreal's more miserable than Tampa. I don't know. And you could say, well, Tampa's a contender right now. Yes, but that Game 7 loss against Washington's still smarting. The thing is, because they made the conference final, Tampa picked up no points this year. So if they'd lost in the second round, they'd be at 250, but they didn't. Montreal, on the other hand, of course, missed the playoffs this year. But, there's some debate. Montreal is one of those teams that there is some debate that started up now about whether or not they're going to be better in 18-19 than they were in 17-18, and whether or not they might be able to get into a wild card spot with some help. My answer to that is they could be in the hunt. Absolutely. Number 19. And might I add that picking up these little tiny magnets to put on the board when they're so tiny they're all stacked on top of each other, not easy. Number 19 is Philly. I just didn't have a way to do this because all of my other big boards are full right now. So I had to use the little magnets. Number 19 is Philly. They've been in the playoffs every even year and out the odd years, it seems, recently. And they tend to accumulate some points. They're currently at 260. So if you're a Philly fan and you're like, where are we in the misery index? You're right there. Number 18 is Minnesota. Minnesota 260. Now you'll notice Minnesota and Philly have the same number. So why would I have Philly as less miserable than Minnesota? Why not just declare them a tie? You can. You can go ahead and do that. For me, Minnesota, I put a little bit ahead of Philly on the misery index because Philly has this really good young defense. There's a lot of hope with Carter Hart. There's a lot of hope with what's going on. Minnesota, there's more of a feeling of we kind of need to win this now, and we're not taking steps forward. So one team seems to be on its way up, and the other one looks like it could be in for a drop. And if you believe the preseason predictions, Minnesota could be in for a drop this year. At 17, and there's a fan base wondering where are we? It's St. Louis, and you guys have 265 points. Gained 50 this year thanks to missing the playoffs. But St. Louis looks like they're in pretty good shape this coming season. We'll see, though. I've seen it before where St. Louis adds. I remember the 1 year Buffalo added everybody. Didn't help. There was 1 year Tampa added everybody. Didn't help. So until we see that lineup on the ice, it's all speculation. But things look good for St. Louis. They still have 265 points. So who's tied for them with 265 points and I've decided is more miserable than St. Louis, who missed the playoffs? That'd be Ottawa, boys and girls. So Ottawa, you're not in the top half of the misery index. That's got to make you guys feel a little bit. No, not even just a tiny, just sort of a little bit. Not even. Okay, all right. We'll just move on. Number 15, which kind of surprised me, is LA. But LA is a feast or famine team, so the 270 points they accumulate don't entirely surprise me. Stanley Cup out of the playoffs. Stanley Cup out of the playoffs. It's one or the other, it seems. This past season, of course, they lost in the first round to Marc-Andre Fleury. And they've armed themselves with Kovalchuk. We'll see how that turns out for them this coming year. It's a big year for LA, the Kings and their fans. And we'll see how it turns out because they definitely have a win now feel due to the fact that Brown is over 30. Kopitar's starting to show some mileage too. And I know he had a great year. I'm just saying that Kopitar's got a lot of games played. And so adding Kovalchuk is they're trying to get back to win one more Stanley Cup before they have to tear it down. 14, Vancouver with 300 points. It has been a miserable last 3 years for Vancouver where they've accumulated 150 points by missing the playoffs 3 years in a row. I don't see them making the playoffs this year either. And so the misery index is going to go up, but there is hope for the future if you're a Canucks fan. Best prospect pool the team's ever had. Bar none. Best prospect pool they've ever had. NHL 19, though, has Jonathan Dahlen as a medium top 6 forward, meaning he's got the potential to grow into a top 6 forward as medium, which is pretty darn good. I was surprised it's that high. I would put him as probably a top 9 medium, or even a high top 9. But anyways, enough NHL 19 talk. Vancouver's at 300 points, and they're 10 points behind New Jersey. Yes, if you're a Devils fan and it's felt miserable lately, you're right. You're number 13 on the misery index. It's sort of like a power rankings, but for crying people and upset fan bases. So with New Jersey at 310 points, of course, that means they didn't get 50 this year. They only got 30, which means that if Canucks get another 50 and New Jersey makes the playoffs, Vancouver moves up the list. There's the standings the Vancouver Canucks can climb. At number 12 with 320 points is Calgary. And it's remarkable to me, even with the years that Vancouver had where they were a pretty good team, it's remarkable to me that Calgary finishes higher on this list than Vancouver. It's just remarkable to me with 320 points. So 20 points ahead. Calgary could very well make the playoffs this year, and Vancouver ends up passing them. Vancouver's going to get to the top of this list. No, they won't. I don't think they will, because we'll get into the teams that are at the top and what's going on there. But Calgary's 320 points. It's a high total. 340 points. Dallas. Yep. Dallas Stars are more miserable than people might think. It's been a long dry spell for Dallas. And it's hard for me to see that, and yet again, by doing my index this way, it doesn't matter if a team is at the bottom of the league and 30th. or 31st, as we now have 31 teams, soon to be 32. It doesn't matter whether they're 30th or they're 17th. So even if they barely miss the playoffs, it doesn't matter. The misery's the same. You still miss the playoffs. So there's Dallas with 340 points, which is upsetting to Dallas fans, including me. Next up on the misery index is Colorado. Colorado made the playoffs this season, so even though they're tied with 360 with two other teams, I dropped them down on the misery index behind those two teams. Because Colorado now has finally put together a really solid team, and it looks to me like they're fallback proof to a certain extent. I don't think they necessarily are going to take a huge leap forward and up in the standings, but I don't see them falling back either. We'll see. Colorado surprised us before, but right now I just don't see it happening. So at number that's 9, right? 3, 4, 5, 6. 9 is the Islanders. The Islanders having a higher misery index than Colorado, even though they have a tie score. Yeah, I'll buy that. The Islanders are kind of reeling from losing Tavares, and they weren't in the playoffs with Tavares. They got this misery index while Tavares was there. So now they've gone out and they've fixed their management, they fixed their coaching. We'll see if that makes a huge difference this year. It really honestly should, because Barry Trotz has been able to make teams better in the past than they should be, and he's going to have that task again with the New York Islanders. Also tied with 360 points, but I feel that they're more miserable. Yeah, Arizona. Arizona, and there's going to be fans saying, wait, Arizona's not number one? No, they aren't. Because after the lockout, they weren't a horrible team, and they had a couple years there where they had the 1 year in the playoffs where they actually reached the Final Four, so they would have got 0 points that year. And they've had a couple of decent seasons that keep them from being at the top of the misery index. But I have them ahead of the Islanders because the Islanders have made the playoffs more recently than Arizona. So there you go. Next up with 370 is Winnipeg. Now, Jets fans are going to point out that of those 370 points, a number of those points are going to be when they were Atlanta. I would counter with they missed the playoffs a lot after they got to Winnipeg too. So I have no problem with that standing. It does mean that Winnipeg has a higher standing for misery than teams that are under them, even though Winnipeg right now is being favored to potentially win a Stanley Cup. So if they end up winning a Stanley Cup, this could look silly a year from now, again, if I do this again. But with 370 and these teams below them with 360, let's say they win a Stanley Cup and stay at 370, odds are they'll drop down to about here or even further down. So, again, I like this system a lot. I think this could work. Next up, in 6th spot with 380 points is Columbus. Columbus either misses the playoffs or they're out in the first round, and doing that every single year, never getting to the second round, means that they keep accumulating points on the system. And I don't have them ahead of another team that has 380, because that other team with 380 is Buffalo. Yep. Buffalo, who have missed the playoffs for a while, had some decent runs before this most recent slide. In fact, what started this slide was the perception that they were good, they weren't really a contender, and they went out and signed some free agents with the mentality of we're going to be a contender with these moves, and then Villaleno, Christian Ehrhoff, and others, just it didn't work. None of them, and it was one of those odd times where it seemed like nobody that they added ended up working out, and Buffalo ended up just tanking from there, and that's where you end up with them just waiting around for McDavid, who became Jack Eichel. Number 4 on the list with 400 points is Toronto. Toronto, the last couple of years, has been out in the first round, which means 30 points each year. That's 60. And they had a lot of playoff misses before that. So since the lockout, yeah, they've had quite the miserable run. 400 points works for me with Toronto. Tied with Toronto, I've got them ahead of Toronto because they missed the playoffs this year, is Edmonton. Oh, the Canadian teams that are on this side of the board. It's kind of sad. You don't see a Canadian team on the board until Montreal here, and then Ottawa, who are here, and odds are next year they'll be on this side of the board as well. So, being a Canadian hockey fan, if you felt like it's been rough since the lockout, you're right. Number 2 on the list, is Carolina with 410 points because they just don't make the playoffs. And that means number 1 with 420 points is the Florida Panthers. So, yeah. Florida, it's misery. It's 420. This stuff writes itself. I don't have to say anything more than that. So there's your list. There's your separation between the teams. 420 for Florida, 410 for Carolina. Edmonton and Toronto both come in with 400. The perception right now is that of those 4, Carolina's the most likely to still miss the playoffs this coming year. Edmonton is also likely to miss the playoffs this coming year. Toronto should make it. Florida, with the amount of momentum they had at the end of last year, and just the fact they have a pretty solid young team, Florida should be a playoff team this year. They should be able to drop from first place again if I do this again next year. But I may change the formula next year like I changed it this year. So there you go. According to my calculations, the fan base with the most misery is that of the Florida Panthers. With that being said, I'm very sorry. I apologize to Florida fans everywhere. And the preseason is really underway today. There's 3 games on today, including 2 that are on right now. And hey, we'll see how this thing shakes out next summer and how we end up with the misery index. But yeah, this is the first time I've done a video where I've needed 2 boards. 2. This is why when people say, oh, you should report on this and report on that and report on this with your history videos, I don't want to do 2 boards for each history video. That's just too much. That's crazy. But there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.